This talk was written about North American English. But English is not a single language. It doesn't have a single standard meaning for every word and phrase the world over. It is possible that the specific things that I say in this talk will not apply to the dialect of English that you speak in your workplace. And there may be more than one dialect of English. There is certainly for me. Unfortunately, I don't have the experience that I would need in order to be able to completely localize this talk for any one of you, much less everyone who might be in this room. So what I'm going to begin by doing is talking about the principles behind the kinds of language that I will be describing today. So you'll be able to see examples that I have from my workplace, and hopefully you'll understand enough about the principles that I'm talking about that you'll be able to figure out what that would mean for you in your workplace. What to listen for. I'm not going to talk a lot about direct insults. I don't think that a lot of us deal with that, hopefully, in our workplaces, and if we do, that's probably something that you take to your management or to whatever sort of HR or employee relations or whatever your workplace has. They're also really easy to identify. It's, if someone calls you stupid, you kind of know that that's happening in that moment, right? It's not surprising, it's surprising that they did it, but the meaning is not surprising. I'm going to talk about things that are more subtle than that, mostly. Words and phrases that might make you feel bad, but leave you confused about why you're feeling bad. These are regionally and culturally variant. Subtle insults and subtle compliments depend on you knowing what the speaker considers good or bad, and what words have good or bad connotations. Those things are strongly influenced by culture and region, even within countries. So I'm going to start by giving you some tools to use when thinking about the meanings of words in English. You can use these tools to think about whether the specific points about language that I make later in the talk apply to your workplace, and if not, what the corresponding language issues might be for you. The denotation of a word is its literal meaning, the meaning that a dictionary tries to define. What is a cat? It's a small four-legged mammal with fur and whiskers, got big ears, right? Sometimes this can be confusing across different variations of English, but mostly because the literal word is different, right? In the UK, a knitted garment that you wear over a shirt is a jumper. In North America, that garment is a sweater. I was reading UK literature as a small child and not understanding this at all. I was deeply confused by all of these jumpers that did not match the thing that I understood as a jumper. But changes in denotation like that, if you have access to a person or a dictionary, are relatively easy to identify, right? You can sort of pick that out, you can have a conversation about it. Someone can explain to me that this is what a jumper looks like, and then I am less confused. Some of the subtlest and most confusing differences between global Englishes are in the connotations of words. Connotations are about cultural or emotional associations. These can be very regional. In North American English, smart is usually understood to have positive associations. If someone calls you smart, they're usually saying something good about you. Clever has ambiguous associations. Sometimes someone will call you clever, and they're sort of like, oh, you clever monkey, you, right? They're maybe complimenting you, but they're also kind of annoyed. And if someone calls you sly, that is probably not a compliment, because that says that you're smart, but you're also tricksy, right? You're not playing fair, you're not being forthright. So those connotations are very important and change, like those may not be the same wherever you are and whatever language, whatever dialect of English you speak. Sometimes you can get really interesting, subtle compliments by using a word in an unexpected way, by taking advantage of these particular connotations and a relationship between you and the person that you're talking to create an unexpected bond. The example that I'm thinking of is if somebody who is very close to me and appreciates my talent for workplace politics, if that person calls me sly for something that I did in the workplace that I know that they have reason to think is a good thing for me to have done, that is a compliment in that context because we have this personal association that this is happening within. And it's a very effective and strong compliment because it is leaning on the negative connotations of the word sly. Implications. In modern American slang, people sometimes say A for effort. If you are not from the United States or not familiar with modern usage and youth culture, this might sound like a compliment. It is not a compliment. What the speaker is saying is that the person they are addressing put in all that effort but did not get any results. The cultural context that this comes from, A for effort, is a cultural context that prizes results, outcomes, things that you achieved. So if someone says A for effort, it's because they can't think of anything else nice to say about what you've done. That is an implication. All of the meaning of that phrase is in the space between the words. It is not in the actual literal meaning of those words. What is happening here is a contrast between the meaning of the phrase, what is being said, and then what the speaker values. Presuppositions are about the conditions that are assumed to exist in order for a question or statement to make sense. If you were to hear my coworker ask me, "Is your sister feeling better?" you could assume from that that I have a sister and that she was sick or injured. Presuppositions become a problem when they're wrong or when a speaker uses them to create a malicious untruth. If you were to hear a coworker ask me, "Did you finish writing those tests?" you might assume that there were some tests that I was assigned to write, and possibly even that the coworker who is asking me this question assigned them to me, that they had the power, the authority to create that expectation between them and me. If those things are untrue, my coworker has just created an untruth in your mind, and possibly in my mind. If they say this to me and I don't come back and say, "No, because no one ever asked me to write those tests," or "No, because that's not my role in this project, that's my friend Mark's role in this project," right? If no one contests that, then suddenly we have a change in what everyone understands to be true and real. So that was a lot of stuff, short amount of time. Those are high-level principles. There's a ton more that you can read. People take classes in this stuff. You can take entire linguistics classes in implications and theories of implications and who came up with what at what time. So I'm going to give you a moment, pause, take a drink of water, let all of that settle, and then I'll move on. Hello, my name is Courtney. I work for Heroku. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming to my talk. I am here to talk about retrospectives and language and how we can be good to each other in meetings. Many of you have probably heard of Heroku. Heroku is a platform as a service. It's one of the easiest ways to go from code in your repository to a running web application. Yeah, Heroku is not new news. Let's talk disasters. Who doesn't like a good disaster where nobody was hurt? Seattle has two of the longest floating bridges in the world. And in 1990, one of them sank over Thanksgiving Day weekend in a storm while it was being repurposed. Thanksgiving Day weekend is the biggest holiday in the United States. Even people who don't have any religious affiliation or anything in common, it's usually a 4-day weekend. Almost nobody is working except for the poor people who have to run the Black Friday sales. So it's a big deal. A lot of people have time off. A lot of things are discontinuous over Thanksgiving Day weekend. And the storm that happened was a 100-year storm, they called it. It was very large and unexpected. So all of this happened at once. The public reporting on this disaster to this day is extremely simplistic, but the official investigation found that there were 5 factors involved, and all of them were required for the bridge to fail. The situation, they were doing what's called hydro-demolition. They were scraping off the pavement on the existing bridge span. They were going to repave it, and they were also building another span next to it. So the entire project was to increase the amount of traffic that could go over the lake, by building a new span and taking the existing span from one that was 2 ways to one that was 1 way, and then having the other traffic come back on the other span. At first, they were allowing the water that they used to scrape the paving off to run into the lake. And then the Environmental Protection Agency said, you cannot do that. This is an environmental disaster. That's toxic. Fish live here. We've got to do something else. You have to store the water, and you have to make sure that it's treated. And since you can't store water in piles, that means you need a container to put it in. What sort of container are you going to put it in? Well, a floating bridge is made of hollow concrete pontoons. It's a little bit like a tanker. I can already see some people figuring out where we're going with this. So it's this big concrete structure made in pieces, and the centers are full of air, right? So that's how it is light enough to float. It's a density thing, really, not weight, but you get what I mean. So they decided to store the water in the pontoons inside in the hollow area and truck it away. So they basically, you have to collect the water, you have to stage it somewhere, and then you have to carry it off. Over the weekend, the storm happened. One pontoon sank first and dragged 7 more down after it. This is a nested cascading failure. Things are more likely to break when you're messing with them. So I'm going to play you a little video, and then we are going to analyze what is in the video and what they actually found when they investigated this disaster. Where is my mouse?
Built in 1940 in Seattle, the Lacey V. Murrow Bridge was named after the director of Washington State's Department of Transportation. The bridge stood for 50 years, but in November of 1990, a rehabilitation and maintenance operation on the bridge led to disaster. Spanning a short but deep section of Seattle's Lake Washington, the Murrow Bridge floated on a row of 25 hollow concrete pontoons, each 350 feet long. The pontoons were bolted together for stability and anchored to the bottom of the lake.
The conditions are just right for use of such a structure because the water conditions under which they're installed are perfect. That is, very seldom is there any ice, very seldom is there a heavy current, and the water is very deep, 200 or more feet.
In the fall of 1990, the Murrow Bridge was undergoing a facelift by means of hydrodemolition, a process in which highly pressurized water is used to break up the roadway. Since environmental regulations prohibited dumping the contaminated water into the lake, it was temporarily stored in the empty pontoons via access holes which were cut into the tops and sides of some sections. The water level inside the pontoons was carefully monitored so the structure would not be compromised. But on Thanksgiving weekend, with bridge crews short-handed, a heavy storm hit the Seattle area. Rainwater drained into the open pontoons. Winds from the storm whipped up the surface of the lake, propelling splash water into the pontoons as well. On the morning of November 25th, 8 waterlogged pontoons sunk into the lake, taking those sections of the bridge down with them and severing 12 anchoring cables of a bridge that was being constructed nearby. While luckily no one was injured, the cost of damage was estimated at $69 million. An investigation of the accident came to a sobering, if unsurprising, conclusion.
After very extensive study and very sophisticated computer modeling methods, the conclusion was that concrete pontoons simply don't float when they're full of water. A very unsophisticated mode of failure.
The Lacey V. Murrow Bridge was rebuilt 2 years later. Though it looks the same from the outside, The pontoons that support the bridge have been divided into smaller sections to minimize damage from leaks, a precaution that underscores the structural similarities between floating bridges and floating ships.
The pontoons were designed with multiple cells, not unlike the multiple cell super tankers, so that failure in one place would not bring down the entire pontoon.
What has happened here, they simply had a ship in which they made a hole in the hull.
So you all laughed at the moment where you're supposed to laugh. This was a giant investigation. They checked a lot of stuff. You do not have to read all of this. It's interesting to see all the things they checked. They sent divers down to the bottom of the lake to investigate the pontoons that sank. They investigated the underside of the pontoons that were still floating. They did a lot of work to try to understand what happened here. And this is the shortest number of words that you can use to describe what happened. I'm going to read it. The loads that created significant leakage were the combined effects of all accumulations of water, including rain after the windstorm, longitudinal flow on the surface of the bridge, so that's water that's on the surface of the roadway that was running back and forth in the wind and the waves, and pumping out of the pontoons through November 24th, 1990. These loads caused static moments, that's pressures, that exceeded the threshold for leakage. Existing cracks were opened sufficiently to allow water to leak into the pontoon. Progressive and accelerated sinking began at this time. Right? So that sounds really bad. That sounds like, come on, we could totally have seen this coming. This should not surprise anybody. You fill something full of water, it sinks in water. Like, come on. But no one does things that they think are going to blow up the world, right? The people who made these decisions, they did a lot of research. They looked at the bridge really carefully before they started any work on it. The bridge was in excellent condition. It was 50 years old, but it was floating higher than they expected. It had been really well designed, and all of the concrete was in really good shape. They did a survey of the whole bridge looking for cracks in the concrete. They found some cracks, fewer than they would have expected for concrete of that age, and all of the cracks were non-structural at that time. So they looked at all of this, they figured out how much extra flotation they had, right, based on where the bridge was supposed to float and where it was actually floating. They figured out their margin of error, they did very careful calculations, they figured out how much water it would be safe to store in each pontoon, and they had a schedule for when the water would go into the pontoon, when it would be pumped out of the pontoon. So it's tempting to say the same thing that that guy did, right? That we should have known better, that this was easily predictable, that this was a bad idea in the first place. But they actually did a lot of work to try to make sure that this was handled carefully, and it still didn't work. They made the best decisions that they could with what they knew and the resources that they had. Asking questions like this, what did you know? What do you wish you could have known, is helpful in a retrospective. Looking over that analysis, and there's a whole paper which is cited in this slide, and my slides will be posted later, so you can actually read the whole paper if you want, if you can get it from JSTOR or wherever. They found that the crews who were supposed to pump the water out of the pontoons were having trouble keeping up with the pumping schedule. So some of the pontoons had more water than they were supposed to have based on the calculations that the engineers did. And they found that the pumping schedule was being followed unevenly, so there were high and low spots on the bridge, which added torque. So once you have more water in the bridge than expected, water unevenly distributed in the bridge, the wind and waves from the storm, that caused some of the spans to flex. And the one that eventually began taking on water flexed enough that some of those absolutely normal cracks in the bottom started taking on lake water. And that dragged the first pontoon down and the 7 after it. So there was a lot going on here. And none of that happened in the reporting, right? That is the most in-depth public reporting that I could find on this disaster. So all of that happened, all of those things that we know, but what we don't know, even reading the really long analysis, No one recorded why the crews were having trouble keeping up with the pumpkin schedule. There's any number of things that could have happened. Maybe they couldn't find enough qualified truck drivers. Maybe they didn't have enough trucks. Maybe they were running out of hoses. Maybe anything, right? There are tons of things that could cause that issue, and none of them were investigated or recorded. Maybe it was a communication problem. But since no one asked those questions and no one wrote down those answers, we're never going to know where that problem came from. And that is the root of what happened to this bridge. So let's talk about how to do better. If we're thoughtful and deliberate in how we talk to each other, we can get better results. The rest of this talk is a crash course in talking to other human beings during retrospective. Yes, someone got it. All right, facilitation. Other ways to think of this: servant leadership, psychological safety. If you're facilitating a retrospective, your main jobs are to keep the conversation blame-free and to not make bad jokes and to run a pretty good meeting. So let's talk about how to talk. This is really foundational. This is called Miller's Law. In order to understand what another person is saying, you must assume that it is true and try to understand what it could be true of. This is the only way to understand something that another person is saying to you that is outside your direct experience. You have to imagine that they are being absolutely honest with you and try to understand what could cause them to say something that seems so strange or counterfactual to you. The person who came up with this, his name is George Armitage Miller. He's also the guy who theorized that 7 is the magic number of things that you can have in your working memory at a time. I learned about this from someone called Suzette Hayden-Elgin. She died recently, unfortunately, in a book called The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense, which talks a lot about presuppositions and implications and some of the other linguistic stuff that I began this talk with. This is the key to understanding systems and people that are not yours, right? Teams that aren't yours, people who run things that you do not run. This is how you can begin to understand why things are the way they are in your organization or in any context, and how to change them. This is a critical tool when conducting a retrospective because no two people have the same experience of an incident, right? I work on an incident with 3 coworkers who I've worked on many incidents with before, but one of them is actually typing commands on the command line. I'm the incident manager, and one of them is actually typing things into our status site for our customers, right? We're working on the same problem. We may think that we have the same understanding of it, but we probably do not. We definitely do not have the same experience of the work that we're doing together. Next, let's talk about blame. English is a pretty blamey language. You knocked over that vase. Why did you knock over that vase, right? Those are questions about fault. You. Yeah, you. I'm talking to you. Don't just walk away. That feels awful, doesn't it? Starting a sentence with you draws a line between yourself and the person that you're addressing. So does using the word you too often. How often have I used the word you in the last 30 seconds? It creates an oppositional conversation. There's the person who's saying you and the people who are being you'd at. Why? Why did you do that? Why'd you do it like that? That also feels terrible, right? That's assuming that you don't know what you're doing. That's the same thing as saying, well, we could have totally predicted that this bridge was going to fall into the lake if we fill it full of water. What were you thinking? Asking a question that starts with why is a request for a justification. It immediately puts the person that you're addressing on the defensive. Why questions get you answers in agentive language? Because I knocked it over. Agentive language is because a person did a thing. Agentive language has blame in the grammar, right? I knocked over the vase. I broke it. Agentive language is also strongly remembered by English speakers, at least based on what I read, people who have English as a first language. So then you have ensured that the blame sticks in the minds of everyone who's listening to this question and the answer. Other things not to say to people: always, never, every time, should, just, only. There's more, but these are the least wanted in a retrospective. If you have a sibling, anything your sibling ever shouted at you when they were mad that made you see red should be on this list. Sometimes children shout things at their parents. Anything that your child has ever shouted at you that made you just like really want to scream, that goes on this list. It might be different if what you're talking about is an API or an RFC, the behavior of some system when you're using these words. But remember that when you describe the behavior of the system, you are describing the decisions that some people made when they built it. And it's more upsetting if these people didn't realize all the decisions that they were making, as how can we ever realize all the decisions that we're making in a moment? And they never know all the consequences of the decisions that they're making. So keep that in mind when talking about systems, bridges, APIs. So here's an example. Don't say this. Why didn't you just fix it the last time this happened? This is not compassionate, and it's not effective. It doesn't help us understand the problem. So let's take this apart. This sentence assumes that it's happened before, maybe more than once, that it could have been fixed the last time this happened. Easily, that's the just. That you was the right one to fix it, and that there was no good reason not to fix it. It's a lot of stuff in a very short sentence. Better things to say. How? What? What if? Could we? What do you think about? What would you have wanted to know? All of these are designed to get more complex answers when used in a question. When asking a question, think about what you can say that will get the longest answer. This can be pretty hard because a lot of us spend a lot of our professional lives asking questions that will get us the most concise answer possible, right? We spend a lot of time trying to have really targeted business communications and not waste each other's time. It's also a valuable skill. We need the opposite skill in this circumstance. You might need to practice asking questions that elicit these complex answers. Think about this as a creative process, both for you and the people who are participating with you. One of the things that you're trying to do together is imagine a better world. When you ask these better questions, what you're looking for is called a remediation item, an idea for change that we can make to code, documentation, processes that will give a different outcome in the future. At Heroku, we're learning to call this contributing factor discovery instead of root cause analysis. Because complex systems have complex failures, as we saw with the bridge. All of those factors were required. If any one of those had not been present, the bridge would not have sunk. So if we talk about a single root cause, that constrains our thinking and our ability to understand the problem. We often hear that something went wrong because of human error. But human error is actually where you should start your investigation. This is the problem with the pumping crews again, right? Well, the pumping crews couldn't keep up with the schedule. Why couldn't the pumping crews keep up with the schedule? What was going on for them in that moment? What didn't they know? What resources didn't they have? So the questions to ask in situations where someone says, oh, it was human error. How did the human make the error? What allowed the error to happen? How did that error then take the system down? How long did the human take to notice the error? And sometimes, I hear some chuckling, right? So how many times do you make a mistake, but then you don't catch it for a while? You've been paged at 3 in the morning to fix something, right? You make a typo. How long does it take you to figure out that that typo happened? What could we do to make it less likely that you have to worry about the fact that you made a typo? Try harder is not a remediation item. That is not something we can expect people to do. The fallacy is, Well, now that we know about this kind of mistake, we could just not make it again. Depending on humans to avoid errors is unreasonable. People cannot be perfectly vigilant, and they can't just be better rested. The person that you have today is the person that you're going to have tomorrow, is the person that you're going to have next month. You can't plan for a perfect human who has no children, no cats walking across the keyboard, no ailing parents, and did not have to get up at 3 in the morning for a page. Not a thing. Now let's talk about how to have a good meeting. Anybody? Anybody? Are you excited? If you're facilitating a meeting, have an agenda, stick to it, and stay on time. This helps keep you from missing things by running out of time. It lets participants know what you're going to cover and when. It helps participants stay with the group. People who get lost and are not sure where we are in the process anymore are going to feel self-conscious and are less comfortable engaging and sharing what they know. Digressions can be boring for the group and inhibit participation, especially if one person has a hobby horse that they talk about every time and they never stop and they keep going and they say it over and over again. You're already bored, right? You should be bored. Staying on track helps make sure that everyone stays engaged. If you're participating, your job is to help the group stay on track. Before you share, ask yourself if what you have to say is on topic and if it needs the entire group's attention. If one of those things isn't true, try to bring it up later in a more appropriate context. Keep your eye on the agenda, stay engaged, even if you have nothing to contribute right now. Even if what's on the agenda does not seem like anything that you have anything to say about, something that someone else in the meeting says might provoke a response in you that is relevant to the group. Sometimes the best findings in a retrospective are about the interactions between participants, just like that, and not just one person saying one thing. You can also help by making sure that note-taking is shared fairly among the participants. If you have 1 or 2 people on your team, and many of us have been on these teams where it's always that person's job to take notes, that person can't contribute in the same way that someone who isn't taking notes can, right? Because anytime they open their mouth, suddenly the notes are not being taken. But also, their focus has to be on recording what's happened. They can't think about whether they have something to contribute as long as their job is to type. So another thing that you could do is volunteer to take notes, make sure that it's shared fairly among everyone in your team. As a facilitator, you might need to practice interrupting people. You need to do this for the good of the group and for the meeting, to stay on track, to make sure that you don't wind up listening to one person and the one thing that they always talk about every time. It's also important when someone starts to blame or rant or make other people in the room uncomfortable. This is really hard. A lot of us have a really difficult time learning how to interrupt. It was hard for me. Remind yourself that you cannot achieve the goals of the retrospective if a single person's behavior goes unchecked, right? If all you have is one person talking and everyone else being silent, you are not getting the good from the retrospective that you need. You are not getting the perspectives of everyone in the room. The best way to practice this is to think about a time that you experienced when someone needed to be interrupted and was not. Do you remember how unpleasant and frustrating that was? And maybe you sort of sat there and like vibrated, like I do that sometimes, or maybe you just like muted the sound to your headphones if you're in a remote meeting because you could not bear to hear that person's voice any longer. Feel that feeling in your body, what it's like to sit there and really wish this person would shut up. And then imagine yourself saying, thanks, teammate, but we're really far afield and we really need to come back to the point right now. Or everyone working this incident did the best they could, and we're here to help figure out what we need to do to make things go better next time. Or if you need to think, you can just say, wait a minute, please. And then give yourself time to figure out how to get the group back on track. Do this gently but firmly. It is possible that the person that you interrupt might even thank you for this later. This happened to me once. We had a very bad billing incident. It was a multi-day incident, and we had messed up any number of customers' bills. And the chief financial officer came to the retrospective. And it was his first ever retrospective, because like, when does an executive need to go to an incident retrospective, right? And we're going through our workflow, and I was managing the retrospective, and he's just like vibrating with tension. And finally, he breaks in and he's like, I can't believe you're all so calm about this. I can't believe that you're not treating this like the serious problem that it is. I can't believe that you're just acting like this is normal. Where is your sense of urgency? This isn't okay. And I had to cut him off and say, I know it is urgent. We're working through it the way that we work through every incident. We can talk about it later if you want. And he was really mad, but he muted himself and he let us get on with it. And by the end, he sort of looked a little sheepish. He came to me a day or two later and said, you know, you were right. You were clearly being thorough. You were clearly doing something that you were very practiced at that I did not know because I'd never been there before, and I was out of line, and I'm sorry. That's probably only going to happen. Like that was the day I should have bought a lottery ticket. That was the one day in my career that was going to happen, right? It's not always going to be like that. But I could keep that with me and that feeling of I did the right thing for everybody the next time that I need to interrupt somebody. As a facilitator, one of your jobs is to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak, even if they have nothing to say. Don't assume that just because a person is silent, it means that they don't have anything to contribute. They might be shy. They might be having a hard time interjecting. Keep an eye on the participants to see who might want to speak, but be afraid to interrupt. Things to watch for: wiggling, leaning forward, licking their lips, pursing their lips as if they're ready to speak, biting their lips, waving their hand. Sometimes this is hard when we're having remote meetings, which Heroku is mostly remote. So like the hand waving sometimes is what we resort to because the visual signal is important. Frowning, nodding, other super engaged facial expressions, like they're really present and they're really just ready to say something. Look for that kind of thing. Take the time to stop the discussion at least once, preferably twice in your retro, and solicit feedback from the people who've been silenced. You can say to the group, I'd like to hear from people who haven't spoken yet. Anyone who hasn't spoken, this is your moment. Keep the group silent for a moment. Give them a chance to respond. And a note about silence. If you want people to interject who haven't been talking, especially if in this particular circumstance there are people who are easily overwhelmed by the speech of other people, you have to give them a lot longer than you think. Invite them to speak. Wait until it becomes uncomfortable. And then wait a little longer. How many times have you been in a meeting and had someone say, anything else? Okay, cool. Anyone who hasn't contributed needs more time than that very brief pause to be able to speak up. So as a facilitator, remember, you need to wait until you feel super uncomfortable and then give it a few more seconds. Okay, let's talk about humor. It is really, 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 really easy to mess up when making jokes in a retrospective. You may have heard the saying, comedy is tragedy plus time. In a retrospective, there has never been enough time. If you're having this retrospective at any time that is relevant to the incident that you had, there has definitely not been enough time. Furthermore, someone, maybe everyone in that retrospective feels like they screwed up and cost the company money and cost their teammates time and maybe cost their teammates sleep and made everyone present have yet another meeting. And their manager might also be there while everyone is feeling like that. Getting it wrong when making jokes in a retrospective means anything that makes anyone in the room feel even a little bit uncomfortable, even if they don't really notice or they won't admit it to you. Some bad jokes. Anything your parents say when they're mad or they think you haven't come home recently enough. Anything you say back to them. Anything a manager or other employee ever said to you that made you feel bad? Anything you ever said to a coworker that made them laugh uncomfortably or wince? Jokes about getting fired or firing people? Don't do it, don't do it. Politics, religion, current events. Avoid all of these topics. They are not funny in a retrospective. Things I shouldn't have to mention that you should not make jokes about, basically ever, but especially in a retrospective. Race, gender, sexuality, fat jokes, jokes about disabilities, jokes about people being crazy, jokes about any one person or their decisions or their wisdom or their plans or their face. You can probably make jokes about Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Entropy, the general terribleness of computers. Computers are the worst, am I right? You can probably be utterly serious about very silly things. Las Vegas, colloquially known as fabulous. Maybe you can joke with a person about something they are proud of about themselves, but this gets dodgy. If you knew that I liked making jokes about myself as the girl with her hair on fire, you might be able to make that joke and it might be okay. The problem is that if everyone else in the room does not know that I like to make that joke about myself, you have made them feel uncomfortable because it looks like you're singling me out in a way that's not kind to me. So it's usually better to avoid that, even if you know that that's something that I am amused by, which I am amused by it. If you can't make jokes, how can you lighten the mood? You can be kind, you can be thoughtful, you can be caring, you can call out successes, you can thank someone for their honesty or for sharing, you can be warm and welcoming. Yep. What about when things go wrong? What do you do when other people blame or make bad jokes? What about when you make a mistake? If you make a bad joke or accidentally say something blamey, or you can tell that you've made someone uncomfortable, apologize, correct yourself, and move on. It's important to be sincere, but be matter of fact. Wallowing in that guilt that you feel in that moment is self-blame. It's very uncomfortable to be around, too. It's time-consuming, and it's part of what you're trying to avoid. You don't want to be blaming yourself in a retrospective any more than you want any other person to be blaming you or another member of the retrospective. When people blame themselves, when it's someone else blaming themselves, you might need to intervene as a facilitator. You just need a short request to them that they stop and then move on. If the person is embarrassed or wants to explain, you can give them a moment, you can thank them sincerely, but then move on. Try something like, this is a blameless retrospective, and that means not blaming anyone, including yourself. We're here to make sure that no one gets blamed, including you. Please don't blame yourself. That's not what we're here for. You don't have to be witty. You don't have to come up with the perfect response in the moment. It doesn't have to be something that makes people laugh. It doesn't have to be something that displays that you're clever or on top of things. You just need to ask people to stop and move on. Your goal is not to win. Your goal is to remind people of the ground rules and why we're here and not waste any time. So if someone asks a blaming question, gently remind themselves that that's what we're trying to avoid and help them rephrase the question in a way that is not blaming. This is all you need. Please don't make jokes like that in a retrospective. Please don't say things like that in a retrospective. That's all you have to say. During the retrospective is not the time to have a teachable moment. You do not need to explain all the things that I've just explained to you about why this is not the moment and the place, and these are not the people to have that with. You don't need to convince anyone of anything. You just need to ask them to stop so the group can move on. If the joke is something self-blaming, like I fat-fingered it, you can gently say retrospectives are blameless. That includes not blaming ourselves. Or you can just ask that they not make a joke like that in a retrospective. Once you've gotten them to stop and the group has moved on, don't bring it up again. Don't talk to them about it outside the retro. As far as you're concerned, it's finished. You asked them to stop, they stopped, we're done. If they come to you and ask you why that was inappropriate, and you feel like you have an explanation that you can give, that you want to give about why that was inappropriate, you should do so. But you can also just reiterate that it's not appropriate in a retro. It's not necessarily on you to explain why they shouldn't say things like that. You could also direct them to the video of this talk if you want. Okay, so what's my point? Many people here have probably seen this. Conway's law, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. He's still alive. That was coined in 1968. It's still true. Your retrospectives are part of this. They're part of the communication structures of your organization. They are part of what produces the systems that you're running. It is turtles all the way down. So let's go make bigger and more interesting mistakes. A bunch of acknowledgements, and some of that is further reading, some of that is like individual people. My former teammate Lex, who is not here, is someone that I did a lot of this writing with. I already mentioned Suzette Hayden Elgin. Kathy Sierra is an excellent teacher. I learned a lot from her about teaching. John Alspaugh, who talks about why versus how. He was where I first found out about that. And some of my other teachers, knitting and pottery teachers, who have taught me how to teach and how to manage a room. Thanks for listening. I have a few minutes for questions, or you can find me later. Go break stuff. You can give them more time. Give them more time.
Hello. Hi. One of the kind of recommendations you have mentioned not to do in a retrospective is the usage of the word why, right? Because I guess it gives an idea of a blame on certain one who has not done certain thing. But one of the common techniques often used in retrospective is the 5 whys techniques in order to kind of look at a problem instead of just addressing the symptoms, be able to find out the kind of root cause. And that technique basically asks why certain things are done in a certain way so that we get to the eventual cause so that we can really address the root cause in terms of the action items to take out. So like kind of get some clarity on this part. Is it not a good option to use a 5 why technique?
So 5 whys, if anyone here is not familiar with that, it's beginning with a why question and asking the answer to that, why did that happen? And then why did that happen? And why did that happen? And it's a technique for sort of digging linearly, right? In each case, you have an answer that you then ask another question to. And 5 is sort of a recommendation. It's not that you have to ask exactly 5 questions. I referenced John Alspaugh. He talks about how he recommends infinite hows instead of why. So if you ask why, you get a very focused answer. If you ask how, you get an answer that is more about the context and what the person knew and what they were dealing with in that moment. So if you ask how questions, you can get this beautiful sort of branching tree of things that you learn, right? So you ask me, how did you knock over the vase? And I say that I tripped over the cat while I was looking for my glasses. So there's several things that we can look at there. Why was the cat in the way? How was the cat in the way? How did I lose my glasses? How can I not lose my glasses in the future? Any of those things, right? We have several avenues to explore just from that one how question. And if we keep going that way, then again, we have this sort of complexity of results that we get. So 5 whys is useful, but I think limited.
Thank you.
Sorry, hi Courtney, thank you very much for that informative talk. So as a Brit working for an American company here in Asia, I hit many cultures throughout my whole week. How much of what you've said comes from your understanding of culture and communication, and how do you think then working in somewhere in Asia, we can try to adapt what you've tried to teach us today to a local culture?
So in that situation, so most of the specific guidance that I gave about specific words is based on research done with North American English speakers who primarily speak English as a first language. And that means that some of those meanings you will encounter, right, working for an American company, and some of those meanings might be different. And one of the things that I understand is different between American and UK English is the meaning of the word quite, right? Quite in one register means a little bit, and in the other one it means very, right? So it's a big difference to be talking across. So in your case, I would do more reading about the principles that I began the talk with and try to think about those in your day-to-day workplace, right? In your situation, I might hear something, notice a feeling in myself, and write it down for later and sort of sit with that. Think about, like, what did that person say? What was my feeling? As much as you can figure out, how did everyone else in the room respond to that? Try to figure out the meanings that are happening between the words, and then which of those were intentional. Because the other thing about communication is there's what I say, what I hope to convey, what you hear, how it makes you feel. And what you hear and how it makes you feel are about your history, your experiences. What I say and what I hope to convey are about my history and my experiences. Some of those are cultural, some of those are personal. So it is, and I guess the last thing that I would say about that is, it is still my responsibility as a speaker to be as kind as I can and to be as thoughtful as I can. And if I inspire something in you that I did not intend to, that's not my, it's not a blaming thing, but to apologize and say, that's not what I meant, I'm sorry, I didn't want to provoke that for you. This is what I hope for us going forward, right? So there's an idea in linguistics that you are responsible for what you say, or that you are responsible for how you interpret things, and I think that's a shared responsibility. I hope that helps. It's kind of vague.